I think we'll start. We're expecting a few more people, but there's already well over 100 people in this event, which is fantastic. Thanks so much for coming today to our event on updates to Disclosure Scotland 2020 Act. And what's great today is that I will not be doing the difficult work here. In fact, the heavy lifting will be done by Duncan Steele, who is the Compliance Officer for Volunteer Scotland Disclosure Services. So in a minute, I'm going to be passing over to him, but I'm just going to say a few words first. So again, welcome to those who are just coming in. This will be a chance to hear about updates, and I think what's great about the number of people who have signed up to this is how seriously the charity sector is taking this, which is fantastic. So thank you all for sparing your hour today to listen to those updates. Because of the number of people that will be on this event today, we're not going to be able to have verbal questions at the end. So what we have done is we have a number of questions that came in beforehand, and we've grouped them together, and we will ask Duncan them at the end if he hasn't covered them in his presentation. And then we will be checking the chat, and we'll be answering questions in the chat. And then if there's specific things that would be good for Duncan to deal with at the end, we'll bring them out at the end. So please do put your questions in the chat. There's a few people here to help with the event. First of all, we've got Paula Mays. She's the person who organised the event. She's the person to ask any very specific questions if you're having technical difficulties or anything of that sort. She'll also be answering some of the OSCR questions. So thanks very much, Paula, for all your hard work with this. We've also got Cameron and Layla from OSCR. Cameron's doing the filming today so that we can capture this event and put it on our YouTube channel, and that will be a way of other people seeing the great input from Duncan. And then Layla is also there to answer questions in the chat. We're also lucky enough to have Pauline Foley from Volunteer Scotland Disclosure Services and Paul McCann from Disclosure Scotland, who will also be helping to answer questions in the chat. The very complicated questions, we'll hand them to them. So I think that's all I wanted to say at the start. Welcome again. I think this is going to be very informative for all of us, actually. And now I'll pass over to Duncan so that he can give us his presentation. If you're ready, Duncan, you're good to go?
Not a problem. Here I should be ready to go here. This is where I now have to try and switch it. So hopefully everybody can now see the Disclosure Scotland Act 2020. Yep. Okay, so say thanks everybody for coming along this afternoon. We're going to be looking at just a sort of a wee update on the process of the Disclosure Scotland Act. So we're just going to be looking at ensuring everybody is aware of what the main principles of the Act are, just highlighting how you can prepare for the Act's implementation, just sort of what you're going to have to be thinking about in terms of the new legislation, what impact it's going to have on yourselves, and also to provide any feedback you may have on any issues that you can see arising. So we should say at this point the legislation has been passed through the Scottish Parliament and is all fine. We'll be looking at the key changes in the bill, group feedback, questions, etc., as we say. So it has passed through the Scottish Parliament. It has received the royal assent there back in July, so it's been signed off. It is going to come into force at some point going forward. But what we're going to talk about today is how the legislation currently stands. So there are things that we cannot talk about just now because they have not yet been set. And so there is going to be sort of further amendments to the legislation going forward. So for example, at this point in time, there is not a piece of the legislation that says what the fees will be going forward. If you're a volunteer, the fee waiver will remain in place going forward, but we do not know what the fees will be for the changes to the legislation. So, it's currently £59 for your PVG scheme membership. So we don't know what that will be going forward. So we can't answer that at this point in time. And importantly, as we've got at the bottom there, the current disclosure process does continue. So even though there is this new legislation on the books about to be implemented at some point, we should still be appropriately doing the relevant disclosure checks when somebody is being put into a position working with relevant children or adults. Okay, so as we say, the implementation is still to be announced as to when the implementation date will be. So that's not yet currently in place, but it will be coming. We're looking probably towards the end of this year into next year, but we don't have a go live date yet, and it is likely to be a phased implementation. So what we're going to be looking at today may not all be introduced on exactly the same date. So for example, they may introduce the changes to applying for a disclosure before they introduce the actual changes to what a disclosure actually is. There will be appropriate lead time between the announcement of the go live date and it going live, so that there can be, from ourselves, from Disclosure Scotland, from groups such as OSCR as well, appropriate training and guidance on the new legislation, so that everybody is aware that when it does go live, what to do from that date going forward. So as we say, circumstances as we find ourselves in at the moment may lead to some amendments going forward. For example, there may be some positions which haven't been thought about prior to COVID, which will now have to be looked at to be covered off by the new PVG system. And as we have already said, not everything is set just now. We are still going to be looking at the costs going forward. So the changes do break down into three main areas: ensuring that the safeguarding of individuals is still going to be there in place. That's a main priority, to ensure that those working with children and protected adults will always be appropriate to be working with those individual groups. We're also looking at ensuring that the system is simpler for you to use going forward. Part of the feedback that was received from organisations was that it can be too complicated, tricky to understand. So others of the aims is to ensure that it's an easier system for you to use. And there's also looking at privacy going forward in terms of an individual's information and what is released to you. So as we'll be seeing, some individuals will have more right to be able to ask for the removal of disclosure information. Okay, so first off, main key change that we're going to have to work with is it's going to become a mandatory system. PVG will become mandatory. Now, most of you are probably already working on the basis that you are using it as a mandatory system at present. That's fine, that's good, but that is not set out within the current PVG legislation. What the change will do is that will require you to ensure that anybody who is working with people under the PVG system will have to be a PVG scheme member, an appropriate PVG scheme member, we should say there. And what that's going to mean is it will be an offence to work in such a role without first joining the scheme or have that individual scheme membership confirmed. So going forward, prior to somebody starting in a PVG role, you will have to ensure that they are an appropriate member of the PVG system. So currently, you can start somebody whilst you're waiting on the PVG coming back. Going forward, you'll have to have that confirmation that they are a scheme member prior to them starting in that position. So that's one of the things we need to think about, is how's that going to change, obviously, our sort of application and recruitment processes. Next sort of change there is that the scheme membership, so currently it's a lifetime scheme membership. Once you join the PVG scheme, you are a PVG scheme member effectively for life, until you're either barred from doing the work or until you remove yourself from the system. So going forward, it's going to be a 5-year PVG membership. So once an individual becomes that PVG scheme member, they will then be on the scheme for a period of 5 years, and at the end, or we should say towards the end of that 5 years, the current thought is that information will be sent out to the individual, to the groups that have done the PVG checks on them, just to ask whether or not that individual is still a member of the PVG scheme in relation to, are they still doing the regulated role for you as an organisation. So that information will go back. If an individual's on the PVG scheme, still in the PVG scheme, their membership will be renewed. If everybody goes back and says, no, they're no longer doing that work for us, then that person can be removed from being an active scheme member, so that only those who are still doing the regulated work will require to be on the PVG scheme and to be continuously monitored. So Scottish Government, Disclosure Scotland, currently estimate that there's around about 300,000 people who are on the PVG system, but who are no longer doing the regulated work. And there is, at this point, no way for Disclosure Scotland to take them off the system without that person going to them and saying, please take me off. So going forward, it will ensure that the scheme is sort of more fit for purpose, only updating and accessing the information on those individuals who require it to be PVG checked. So individuals should then be able to make multiple applications during their membership to make the scheme more portable. And what we're looking at there is an individual being able to be on the scheme and to then give employing organisations access to their information to be able to see that they're already a PVG scheme member. So it will be a different process from what you currently have just now in terms of doing the existing member application form, be it the paper copy or the sort of the Word document. There will hopefully be a method, as we'll look later at the digital application process, of allowing you and the individual to access that information appropriately. And as we say, so this will, reducing the membership only to those who require to be in the PVG scheme, will ensure that appropriate GDPR data protection policies, procedures will be carried out, followed by Disclosure Scotland, by organisations such as yourself. So it won't be, as we've got at the moment, the individual's responsibility to remove themselves from the PVG scheme going forward. You'll also have that opportunity at the end of the 5-year membership to remove the individual. Now, what we need to talk about with the 5 years of membership is that it will not automatically be 5 years of membership from when they are working or when you did the disclosure on that individual, because they may have joined the PVG scheme prior to starting working or volunteering with you. So they may have been on for a year or 2 years, and it may be that their 5-year membership runs from that time. So another thing that is still to be finalised is the transition period of the 1.3 or so million people who are already on the PVG scheme onto the next version of PVG with the 5-year membership, to ensure that that's done appropriately and that there is then hopefully a staggered changeover over the end of everybody's 5 years of membership, so that we don't have 1.3 million people want a new PVG on the same day. Okay, next area of change is there will be an age restriction put in place on the PVG system. Currently, there is no age limit on who you can PVG check, but what we're looking to bring in is an age restriction of 16 for PVG membership. So nobody under the age of 16 will be able to be a PVG scheme member. They will still be able to do the regulated role for you, but you will not be able to PVG check them. So currently, for example, if you get somebody, let's say, who's 15 coming in and work experience from school, and you think, right, we should be PVG checking them, and you do that, that's fine. But going forward, you will not be able to do that PVG check because they will not be able to be a PVG scheme member. The Scottish Government does not want to subject people who would be classed as children to the continuous monitoring of the PVG system. So it is looking then that anybody under 16 can still do the work, but you will not be able to do that disclosure check on them. And what that also means in terms of working with children is any convictions that have been accrued by an individual, so any conviction between the ages of 12 and 17, will not automatically be released to you on the disclosure. So again, the Scottish Government is wanting to ensure sort of childhood information is not going to have a major impact on people going forward if they have left that inappropriate behaviour behind. So what will happen is anybody does have a conviction, you know, from when they were between 12 and 17, Disclosure Scotland will now evaluate that information, and if they think it is no longer relevant, they will not place that information onto the certificate. If Disclosure Scotland think it is relevant, that information will then be forwarded to the individual, and they will then be given the opportunity to lodge a request to have that information removed. And there will then be an independent reviewer who will make a final decision as to the suitability of that information, whether it should be on or should not. So childhood convictions will no longer automatically be on an individual's disclosure. It will be sort of evaluated for suitability first to see whether or not it should be released. Okay, so now we're looking at regulated roles. So currently, when you're accessing a PVG, you're looking at whether or not somebody is doing regulated work. And going forward, what we're looking at is instead there will be regulated roles that will replace the regulated work. Now, I've had to write this down because I can never remember exactly where it is. But what we'll do afterwards is I'll send over to Paula a copy of the presentation. There's a handout as well. It gives further information. We'll also send you over a link to the Disclosure Scotland bill on the legislation website. And within that, within Schedules 3 and 4 there, is what are going to be the main areas of regulated roles with children and regulated roles with adults. So they set out the main areas of what's going to be, the work going forward that will bring somebody into PVG. Now, what we've then got is that Disclosure Scotland will also then look to publish a list of, as they say, they're typically encountered roles that qualify for the PVG check. So that will be roles that fall into the regulated roles categories that will be set out, as we say, in Schedules 3 and 4 of the Disclosure Scotland bill. So just for example, I am going to just go to the regulated roles with children, and it sets out that, for example, a regulated role is a role which involves carrying out various bits and pieces. So, for example, involves training or studying to carry out one or more activities mentioned in various parts of this schedule. So things like acting as a foster carer, being in charge of caring for children through childcare, teaching, instructing or delivering training to children, and so on and so on and so on. And that goes down to things as well, such as sports coaching, religious activities, transportation, and so on. So there are various bits and pieces in Schedules 3 and 4 that you can have a look at. And as I say, going forward, Disclosure Scotland will create this list of typically encountered roles, which we hope will fall into the regulated roles area, which will bring in people to the PVG system. So going forward, you're not going to need sort of an internal list of your own positions. What you're going to have to show is that the people doing the regulated roles for you fall into one of the PVG regulated roles. As we say, roles will be determined by things such as power or influence that you will have over children or adults. So that's a change to the regulated work to regulated roles. At the moment, some individuals who hold the ability to have power or influence over young people or adults do not qualify for PVG, but going forward, this will now fall into the scope of PVG, in that if somebody is in a position to hold power or influence over somebody, they will fall into PVG. And as we've got there as well, another change is that currently children are under 18, adults are 16 and above. The change is going to level that off at 18. So everybody under 18 will now only be a child. Everybody 18 and above will only be an adult. So where that can maybe cause some difficulties for groups is currently, if you are offering a service and it is to people 16 and above, and it is an adult service, so you're getting PVG checks for working with adults, going forward, if you're offering the same service, then it may be that you may have to PVG check your staff and volunteers for children as well to cover the 16 and 17-year-olds. or that they are working with. And as we said, the presence of specific activities will determine the disclosure type. So the work that somebody is doing will determine whether or not they need what's currently PVG, what's currently the basic standard and enhanced. Okay, so another thing that's going to be introduced is what's called standard conditions. And what this is going to do is this is going to mirror effectively the PVG scheme to regulatory bodies such as the SSSC, the Care Inspectorate, where an individual has to be suitable to start doing the role. So the PVG system going forward will be able to say to you, even though this person is only under consideration for listing, you cannot have them starting to do that regulated role for your organization. So that's going to be where it is, as we say, they're the most serious of cases. So currently, if somebody has a conviction for an automatic barring offence under the PVG system, they are automatically barred. But if that conviction was prior to the implementation of the PVG system and barring lists, that individual would be placed under consideration for listing. So you can have a very serious offence, but the PVG system still says technically you are able to do regulated work with vulnerable groups. So what the standard conditions will do is in situations such as that, where somebody does have a very serious conviction, that individual will effectively be removed from the workforce at the point they're placed under consideration for listing. The consideration for listing is going to bar them. The system knows that, so it's going to be able to say to people or to groups such as yourself, you cannot employ that person in a regulated role at this point in time. So going forward, as we are there sort of talking about appropriate, inappropriate people, this is not a change, but it is something we do all need to be aware of. The legal responsibility for you, the legal requirement for you to make a referral where a person has been permanently removed from regulated work because of inappropriate behaviour towards vulnerable people, that will remain in place. So even if all of the legislation changes going forward, this still remains. You still are legally required to pass information back to the protection unit at Disclosure Scotland if somebody behaves inappropriately and you then remove them. Now, why we're talking about standard conditions and also making sure that all the referrals are done, because what the system is going to do is it's going to remove court referrals. So currently, if an individual is convicted of an offence that is an automatic barring offence, then that is passed to Disclosure Scotland and an individual can be disqualified from doing the regulated roles. But they may never work with children. They may never have worked with children or adults. They may never want to work with children or adults, but they are still barred. So going forward, that's going to be removed to ensure that the automatic barring offences that are passed on will be for people who are doing the regulated roles with children, with adults. So the court referrals will be removed for people who are no longer, or who are not, shall we say, working with children, protected adults, who are not previously looking to do that going forward. So then, if in 10 years' time, well, probably more like 15 after they have left prison, etc., if they then applied for a PVG role, they would then be barred at that point because they have the automatic barring offence previously. So going forward, only information that is relevant to people who are on the PVG system who are working with vulnerable individuals will be passed by the courts. But what's going to be added is Police Scotland will now have the opportunity to make a referral where they have detected a person or people who are unlawfully working with vulnerable groups. So for example, where there you have employed people who are already barred, or where you have people working for you in regulated positions who are not PVG scheme members. So that the Police Scotland will now be able to pass that information on directly. Okay, now another area here around sort of safeguarding is we've got their personal employment self-directed support. So currently, if you want to run your own care package, you're deemed to be the employer, and as you are a personal employer, you do not get all of the vetting information that is available about an individual if you PVG check them. So if you want to hire somebody to come and help you out, you can do the check on them, but it doesn't tell you what vetting information is available. It just says this person is suitable to work with adults, this person is not suitable to work with adults. So you can have no vetting information. The person could have 20 pieces of vetting information, but you wouldn't find that out. So what the change is going to do here is it's going to allow appropriate umbrella bodies to act on behalf of people who are receiving personal care and to do the PVG check on their behalf, so that they will get back the PVG with a list of the vetting information, if there is any vetting information, and they will then be able to assist the person doing the personal care to come to an appropriate recruitment decision about whether or not they should employ that person. So we say the current route of accessing that by individuals themselves will remain in place, because we do understand not everybody will want to go through an umbrella body. Some people will still want to do it themselves. So they will still be able to do that themselves, but there will be that opportunity there for them to go through an umbrella group to get the full vetting information to that umbrella group. Because as I say there, and also the legislation at present does not allow, as it says there, private citizens who employ personal assistants to refer those employees to Disclosure Scotland. So if you were in receipt of self-directed support, self-directed care, and you did have an issue with the person that you had employed, currently you cannot refer them to the PVG system. You would have to pass that information on to the police and hope that they take the appropriate action. Okay, so when we're talking then about simplifying the PVG system, what we're going to see is the disclosures taken down to two distinct levels, level 1, level 2. And as we're saying there, we are all committed to increasing training and guidance to ensure that everybody understands the new system before these are going to be implemented. So what we're going to see is level 1 is going to be what is in effect your current basic disclosure. So anybody in any role, your employer can ask you to do a basic disclosure. So that will remain, will be what's called level 1. So everything else will be level 2. So the current standard and enhanced disclosures will move over to being level 2. If you are doing an enhanced disclosure with a suitability check, then that will move over to level 2 with suitability. And if you're accessing a PVG, that will move to level 2 PVG. Now, what the change here will be, a big change for organizations and groups here, is when you submit the application, the plan is that when the application is submitted with the information around the organization, the regulated role, etc., it will then be Disclosure Scotland who will then funnel your application to the appropriate level. So you will not, as you currently do, have to tick around, is this a PVG? Is it a scheme record update? Is it a scheme record? Is it a scheme membership statement? You'll be looking to do a level 2 application, for example, and then Disclosure Scotland will evaluate the information that's been supplied on the organisation, on the position, and be able to say, right, that's PVG, that's level 2 with suitability, that's just a normal level 2, or that's a level 1 basic disclosure. So that will make things hopefully easier for us all in doing disclosure checks, in that the information you're supplying will not have to be, as convoluted on the disclosure applications. Which one of these 10 boxes do I cross? Disclosure Scotland will now be looking to make that decision for you. And one of the other key change, you can hear you all cheering already, is a digital delivery system for the entirety of the PVG system. So from application to certificate will hopefully be digital. In terms of, we've currently got the Word documents you can use to submit applications at present, but going forward, we are hoping there will be a digital portal that will allow you to access the PVG that way. So, you know, you'll log on to the portal, you'll enter in your information, it will be submitted, organisation would have to sign it off, etc. And then there would hopefully be a notification to groups to say the certificate has been issued. Then you can log on and access that information. So that's what we're hoping to see, to have that in place to ensure that the system is easier to use. And that will make the system quicker as well. Some of you may have had questions earlier when we said, right, you're going to have to do a PVG check prior to the person starting, and you think, right, well, I've got to send it off in the mail, and it's got to come back in the mail. This will speed things up in relation to, you know, fulfilling an individual's disclosure. So it will, there goes my landline again, that's good. So then what we will have is the individual doing the disclosure. It will be digital, so you're taking out 2 days in the post here, you're taking 2 days out of the certificate coming back, so it will be a quicker system for you to be able to access somebody, because we do understand if you need that disclosure prior to them starting, then we'll want to get that information as quickly as possible. Okay, so then we come to privacy around an individual. So an individual, when they have information on their disclosure, that information is filtered in line with the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act. But there are certain offences which currently have rehabilitation periods which are extended under PVG because it is deemed to be a relevant and serious offence that relates to working with sort of children protected adults. So currently that information can stay on for a maximum of 15 years or a minimum of 15 years, depending on what the offence is. So for example, a conviction for, I'm trying to think of a nice one that falls under that. Not many of them are very nice, but a conviction for assault, shall we say, a non-serious assault. I hate to use the word non-serious with assault, but let's say it's an assault to endanger life, would stay on for a minimum of 15 years, but a non-sort of serious assault would stay on for a maximum of 15 years. So going forward, that's going to be brought down to 11 years. Because that is what is in place elsewhere in the UK, and it also allows for still the significant extended disclosure of the serious information that may be on somebody's record. So if somebody does have a serious assault conviction, you will see it for longer than under the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act, because it is deemed to be relevant information to that person working with vulnerable groups. So say it there. Now, again, another change around an individual's information will be an application process, or we should say a different application process for removing convictions. So as we said there, information can stay on the individual's disclosure for what will be up to 11 years, but people will be allowed to appeal that information to have it removed earlier than the 11 years if it meets the relevant criteria. Currently, that is, we've got there is a complex and disproportionate system which relies on the individual unfortunately having to go via the sheriff court to lodge that appeal and to have the sheriff evaluate it, etc. So what we're looking to introduce is an internal process at Disclosure Scotland where the individual will be able to say to them, can you please take that information off? If Disclosure Scotland agree, that's fine. But if then Disclosure Scotland say, no, we still think it's relevant information and individuals should have that information, you know, on their disclosure. Again, the independent reviewer will be there. They can go to the independent reviewer and say, right, can you make a decision on whether or not that information is going to go out or not? So this independent reviewer, we should say, as the name sort of suggests, they will sit separately from Disclosure Scotland, from ourselves at Volunteer Scotland as well. This will be somebody who will make decisions based on the information that is provided to them. And on your disclosures as well, I don't know if any of you will have had other relevant information on the disclosures that you have had back, but at the bottom of our disclosure certificate is the other relevant information section, and there Police Scotland can put down information that they think is relevant for an organisation to see about an individual. It does not have to be criminal conviction information. It can be police intelligence about yourself. It can even be, as we've seen previously, it can be police intelligence about individuals that somebody lives with. But going forward, the ORI here, the other relevant information, Police Scotland will again have now a duty to consider representation from the applicant before that is included on a disclosure. So if Police Scotland want to release that ORI, again, the individual will have the opportunity to lodge an appeal to say, please take that offer, to discuss that, should we say, with Police Scotland, so that that information will not be on their disclosure. If Police Scotland come back and say, again, we're keeping that information on because we do think it is relevant, again, there will be the option to go to the independent reviewer to have them assess that information to say whether or not that should go on a disclosure or not. So, key changes, as I have a quick summary there. The system will become mandatory. You will have to have everybody appropriately PVG checked prior to them starting. We're going to replace regulated work with regulated roles, standard conditions for those who are going to be inappropriate to do the work. Referrals remain in place for organisations. Personal employment, individuals will be able to get an umbrella body to do the full PVG check to get all of the vetting information. We're going to have a simpler application process down to 2 levels, Disclosure Scotland making the decision on what level of check you're getting. We'll have a digital delivery system, then a membership length as well of 5 years. So we're going to have to think about, right, how do we renew our staff and volunteers going forward? Onto the other column there. Age restriction of 16, so nobody under 16 can be on the PVG system. You'll still be able to do regulated work if you're under 16, but not be on the system. Childhood conviction information will be reviewed prior to release. And then same with removable convictions and the ORI, the individual will be given the opportunity to request the removal of that. If it doesn't come off, then that individual can go to the independent reviewer for them to decide whether or not it should stay on. And as we've got there as well, it will reduce the disclosure period for certain convictions down to 11 years from 15 years for those that are deemed to be serious and relevant. Now, so say, what about just now? So the current PVG scheme continues. If you've got PVGs, you need to do your PVGs. I know we're saying, you know, it's going to be relevant, it's going to be a 5-year membership going forward, but don't wait until somebody announces the change of legislation to do your PVG checks. Make sure that everybody currently is appropriate to do the work. So there will be training and support on offer to organisations, both from ourselves, so say we've got Paul here from Disclosure Scotland. So if you are registered with Disclosure Scotland, I'm sure Paul will be glad to also offer you training and support. And as well as what we can do is also offer training and support to individual groups if required. So if you are looking for training on current PVG system, form filling, etc., we will be hopefully available to do that for you. So you can contact us if required. And also we will be sending out appropriate relevant information on our emails and website and newsletters. To say, the go live date isn't yet, it hasn't been announced yet. When it is announced, when it will hopefully have an appropriate lead time, and we will be offering, as will Disclosure Scotland, there will be a lot of training, guidance and support available to all organisations prior to the implementation of the new PVG system, as we want to ensure that when it does go live, everybody is able to use it from day one to ensure that you are following the appropriate criteria. Okay, so now we come to any sort of questions people had then.
Okay, Duncan, thank you very much. That was excellent. A lot of information covered there. And I think the first thing to say is there's hundreds of questions in the chat box,
I
and
could
as
see
Paul
I could
has
see the
said,
number going up there in the corner. Yes.
So what we'll be doing is Paula will work with you just to make sure that we capture all of the questions that have been asked today and give replies to people in a form that they can all get the value from, which will be great. I've got a few questions that I'm just going to, ask you now, Duncan, to respond to. You've covered part of this, but just talking about the current scheme, you've already said some people are worried about timeframes at the moment. How is that looking in terms of the stress on the organisation? But also, is it still the case that there's being priority put on people who are looking for PVGs for COVID-related care staff and so on? If you could just say a little bit about that, that would be great.
Okay, yes. So yes, because of obviously COVID and social distancing, etc., we, for example, cannot have as many people in the office to process forms. So therefore, there are sort of slight delays on applications, because if you're sending one in, for example, as a paper form at the moment, we might only have 2 people in the office who can work on that form. Whereas if you're sending in as the Word version, we've got sort of 10 people who are able to work on that via email. So we are aware there are delays. We are doing our best at present to work with the system in place, but we do have to also ensure that all our sort of staff as well are, looked after and not putting themselves in, inappropriate positions. So we are aware of that. So we're trying to work around that. As we say, if people can do the electronic forms at present, that's better for us. Those will go through, quicker than the paper versions at this point in time. And we should say yes as well, that if you are in a COVID response role, then yes, you can access a priority application, and they will be, if you like, fast-tracked through the system to ensure that those that are providing support to COVID situations are getting the appropriate one. I think, as we said there, so people working in care homes, for example, they would get a quicker PVG response. But this is where we say, do not submit the COVID support roles for roles that are not COVID support roles. It has to be specifically where it is a position that is there in response to coronavirus work that you are doing, and you have to be working in a qualifying sector such as care, such as childcare, such as health. If, for example, if you have said to yourself, right, we're going to take on, and we're going to take on another cleaner, to say we've got 2 cleaners to work, in our building to ensure it's appropriately clean, that wouldn't fall into COVID, because the cleaner is not necessarily there just to support, the COVID work. So it has to be a role that is there to specifically support the COVID response.
Great, thanks, Duncan. That's very clear. I think one thing that sometimes gets confusing for people, and it came in as a question beforehand, is about there's different disclosure regimes across the UK, and also there's the issue of international volunteers. So could you just make it very, very clear, obviously if you're working in a regulated role in Scotland, you need a PVG. What if you're a UK organisation, what do you do about your different disclosure checks, and how does that fit in with Disclosure Scotland? And what about international volunteers? Could you just clarify that stuff?
Okay, yes, so PVG is for anybody who is doing what is currently regulated work in Scotland. So if somebody is doing regulated work in Scotland, they should be a PVG scheme member. It does not matter where they live. So if you're in the borders, for example, and you've got people crossing, the border from, say, England, say from Carlisle to Gretna, for example, to do a regulated role position, even though they live in England, you should still PVG check them. The PVG system, the DBS system in England and Wales, the Access NI system in Northern Ireland, they work on the basis of the individuals should be appropriately checked for the region where the work is being undertaken. So again, with overseas volunteers as well, it's whether or not they're doing the regulated work sort of in Scotland. So if they are doing that work, you can PVG check them. So individuals employed as well by sort of Scottish organisations recruited in Scotland. So if you recruit somebody in Scotland to go and do regulated work in England, Wales, Northern Ireland, you would normally get the individuals then DBS checked, Access NI checked. If you're sending an individual overseas to do what would be regulated work outside of the UK, you can still PVG check the individual for that. And again, going forward, that will become mandatory, because that would be classed as regulated work if they were doing it in sort of the UK and Scotland. So if you recruit somebody in Scotland to work outside of the UK, you can PVG check them at present. Again, it's not mandatory, but going forward, that will become a mandatory system.
Great, that's nice and clear. Thanks very much. I think a lot of the anxiety in some of the questions coming through was about timing, and I think you've sort of touched on that you're hoping that the new system will be quicker because it's digitally based, and I suppose some of the anxiety is around what do people do in terms of you know, they're getting people into roles. Can they not even start to train them until they've been checked and so on? So if you could maybe just touch on that a little bit, that would be great.
They can, yes, you can at present. As we say, the system is not mandatory just now. So you can have somebody in to go through an induction program, a training program prior to the disclosure coming back. That's fine. That's not a problem. Going forward, it has not been set out yet whether or not that will still be allowed. So that is something we'll be waiting to see when all of the appropriate guidance is issued around the disclosure process. But another thing around timeframes there as well, which I should have mentioned earlier, which is if you are currently employing an individual who is now going to be moved to being considered for listing or to be barred from doing the regulated work, Disclosure Scotland will always contact the organisation there directly. So they don't pass that information to us for us to pass that on to you. That information always comes from Disclosure Scotland. So there should not be any delays in passing on to you information about somebody who may be working for you who is now under consideration to be barred or who has been moved to being barred. You will get that at the same time frame as you were getting it sort of pre-last March.
Great. And we understand, we've had Pauline respond about the digital stuff. There's no date for that system yet, which is not surprising. But when it is ready, will there be an option for people who are not online to be able to still use the system? And if so, how is that going to be managed?
Yes, you're looking at the same sort of system as you have at present. There will still be paper forms available. Because again, the Scottish Government do understand that not everybody will want to use a digital system. Not everybody will be able to use a digital system. So there will be the paper forms available for an individual to be able to submit the information that way, if that is how they choose to do it. So that's not going to be, hopefully, a big issue for individuals and groups. So if you want to do it paper-based, you will still have that option.
I would add there, Duncan, that the legislation was drafted specifically to ensure that Disclosure Scotland has a responsibility to maintain a paper channel. So we wouldn't be meeting the legislation if we didn't allow for that to still exist in the future.
Great, thanks, Paul. I think one of the lessons for us over this year, though, however, is we also have a responsibility as public bodies and non-public bodies to be supporting people to get digitally enabled wherever possible. So it's absolutely great that paper channel will still exist, but we kind of know that for everybody, ultimately, it will make it faster and whatever. So sort of investing and finding support to get people digitally enabled is something that's quite important. But thanks, that's great. So people can be rest assured that you won't be cut out if you can't do it digitally, which is very good. There's a question that came in beforehand about the relationship between the organisations and Volunteer Scotland, Disclosure Services, and Disclosure Scotland, and whether really the relationships are actually not going to change. It's just the system that's going to change. And I think that's maybe about, well, I'm not exactly sure what that's about, but Duncan, maybe you could say a little bit about whether there's going to be any significant changes to how that works.
Yeah, in terms of it being, as I say, a digital process, in submitting applications through a portal. So basically the way you do currently interact with Volunteer Scotland Disclosure Services and indeed Disclosure Scotland will change. But until we have a final system in place, we don't know how fully the system is going to change, how much, I don't want to say how much more you may have to do, how much less you have to do in relation to the applications. See, I don't want to say too much in case it all changes going forward. But basically, the system should allow you as an organisation to upload the information about who you want to PVG check. That individual will then be sort of emailed a code, which they'll then have, I believe it's 7 days they are currently suggesting. They'll then have 7 days to respond to that code, to click on the appropriate link and to enter in their relevant information. So you may not, have to fill in forms and have to fill in lots of stuff online. We've just got to see what the final system looks like. But it will, as we say, if you're using the online system, it will slightly change the way that you are interacting with ourselves and Disclosure Scotland.
Great. Thank you for that. There was an interesting set of questions, or a few questions that came up in the chat as we were going through, about people slightly worried about how this new system would perhaps stymie the kind of more spontaneous volunteering that we've seen during COVID. You may not, any of you, Paul or Duncan, have an answer for this, but for instance, if you can't start work till something is PVG checked, for instance, about a volunteer who's taking on a role of delivering prescriptions that might be quite sensitive prescriptions to quite vulnerable people and so on, would that activity have to be PVG checked? And therefore, how would we manage that in a crisis situation, I suppose?
Right, okay. Maybe Paul will differ here, but hopefully prescription delivery is not, for example, a position that falls under PVG at present. So you would not require the person to be PVG checked. The thing to remember is people will still be able to volunteer and work for you, but it will just be the regulated roles that they'll not be able to do until the sort of confirmation of their membership. And that's one of hopefully what will be the good things about the digital delivery, is if the individual is already a PVG scheme member, it should be relatively straightforward to submit the application digitally, and then because they're already a member, to get that information back to you. I've just promised that, and if it all goes
I know exactly. Paul, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with what Duncan said there in terms of that specific role.
Thank goodness.
When people see the list of kind of activities that are involved in PVG, it will make things a lot simpler about how they work out which roles will fit and which won't. You don't have to jump through the sort of hoops that the current setup demands, where you're having to work out what is the contact and all that kind of stuff. It will be much, much clearer, much simpler, so it will make for an easier route in. And the other thing I would say, sorry, Duncan, the other thing I would say is that there's loads of things that people can do short of doing regulated work, whether it's training, whether it's being supervised throughout the course of their work, so they're not actually fully engaged in the regulated role to that extent, which will allow organisations to buffer that time between maybe offering a job and receiving the I was going to say certificate there, but certificate might even be a misnomer, because if we're dealing with a fully digital service in the future, now we're hopefully not talking about you waiting for days on something arriving in the mail. It should be something a bit more instant than that. And the promise that's made in the legislation is that we will be doing the best to make this the most digital, probably even digital is a word that will not be the most accurate going into the future, but it will be the most kind of as instant as we can make it, and something that people will be able to see much, much quicker than they're seeing just now.
And so the other thing I was going to say there, which is something you didn't cover earlier, is, and I think somebody did ask a question prior to today, which was whether or not the incidental test will remain in place. So, and that will still be there. So it will still be an individual's normal duties to do the regulated role for you to get the PVG membership. So in terms, as you say, of sort of spontaneous volunteering, an individual, if they're doing it as a one-off, still will not require a PVG check. So
Great.
hopefully that will still enable you to have volunteers coming in to do roles without having, and as Paul was saying, the various activities that don't fall into PVG, to have them able to work or volunteer with you without waiting on a disclosure.
That's great. Can I just ask a quite specific question, because I thought it was quite interesting. It's interesting now that it's 16 and over. Is that right? Or over 16? Over 16.
So it'll be, yes. So 16 and above will be
and
able
above.
to be PVG members. Yes.
Right. So what if somebody was sort of saying, well, what if you had a volunteer already who was under 16 but is going to become 16? Do you have to wait for them to be 16 to actually, get them checked? But again, I guess if it's a quick process, it's much more, it's a moot point. But I just thought it was quite interesting, that kind of age.
Yeah. Now, there is, I believe, in the legislation, there is a small caveat for people under 16, which is, for example, school leavers and similar who may need a PVG check a couple of weeks before they become 16 because they've got employment lined up for when they turn 16. Those PVG checks will be allowed, but the individual would have to show that they're going into employment, etc., that requires that check. But say anyone else under 16 will not be able to be disclosure checked or PVG checked.
Yeah, that's great. And I suppose, again, thinking about young people, there's a question that just came in there about if you're working with people who are 17 or 18, at school, but they're not left alone with other children. I'm imagining that fits the incidentals, or that's not a group that would necessarily need to be PVG checked, or are you able to answer that?
Well, again, it comes down to sort of the activities that the person will be doing with 16 and 17. So you don't. One of the things about PVG currently and going forward is you do not have to be unsupervised with vulnerable individuals to fall into the PVG system. So as we say, so the activities, as we said there earlier, so under education and training, it says teaching, instructing, or delivering training to children. So if you are doing that on a regular basis with children, then that would bring you into PVG. So you don't have to be unsupervised with those children. It's whether or not you are carrying out the activity on a regular basis with them.
Great. Listen, there's so many million other questions, but we're actually coming to the end of the time. We had put aside an hour, and I realise that you'll all have squeezed this into your very busy days. So I'm just going to ask you, Paul and Duncan, if there's anything you want to say to sum up, and then we'll bring this to a close. Paul, is there anything final that you felt coming through the chat, or anything else you'd like to pick up before we finish?
There's only the one aspect that I really wanted to give a bit of context to, and that is the idea that for a lot of organisations, and I would bet a lot in the public sector and a lot in the charitable sector, it's became the organisation is owning the disclosure part of the process for individuals. And a lot of the cultural change that this Act is seeking to do is to put it back onto the individual, to make the individual the owner of their disclosure information. So I think we'll have a lot of concerns about that. There might be concerns in your organisations about, will people want to volunteer? Will people want to do the work if they have to go through all that red tape? But I think it's a part of the process that we are going to have to face, particularly when we're dealing with 5-year renewals of scheme memberships. It's going to place a lot more of the emphasis on the individual who's volunteering or doing the work rather than the organisation. Now, plenty of organisations will find ways to manage that and ways to support. But I think it's very important that we get across that culturally, the way people treat, say, their membership of regulatory bodies would be more similar to how we expect it going forward with disclosure. So
thank you, Paul.
That's
a great reflection. Duncan, is there anything else you'd like to say at the end before?
Oh, I think all we would want to say is, I know it might seem like a lot of information there and a lot of changes to the system. But it has, as we've already said, it's been designed to make the system easier to use. As Paul said there, it's been designed to ensure that the individual scheme members have greater management of their own information. So what we would say is, don't panic. There will be all of the available appropriate guidance, advice, training, support to everybody prior to the implementation and obviously post-implementation of these changes as well.
Thank you, Duncan. Okay, that has been excellently informative. So thank you to everybody who answered questions. Thanks to people who put questions in the chat. I am so sorry that we couldn't get to more of them, but there are just so many. We have that commitment to go away and do some work on that. Thank you all for coming. And what I would say is that for OSCR, as the charity regulator, we see this as a very, very important piece of work, which is why we have over the years and will continue to do so, work quite closely with Volunteer Scotland and with Disclosure Scotland, and make sure that we are playing the part that we can play to make sure you're getting the information you need. So we will continue. Yes.
Can I just throw in one last thing here as well,
You may.
which Jude and Paula won't like, but I'm just going to say it anyway. Which is, of course, if you know how it is, if you wake up tomorrow at 4 o'clock in the morning going, oh, I wish I'd asked that question, then I'm going to say feel free to contact Jude and Paula with the questions, and then Pauline and I will just ignore them when they try and pass them on us. But no, if you do sort of think of any questions you haven't asked or been answered today, then please pass them on. And you know, if Paula and Jude there are going to pass them on to ourselves, that'll be fine. We'll look to answer them and, you know, pass back the information so that they can pass that back to everybody.
Thank you. That's great. Thanks, Duncan.
You're welcome.
So all of them, it just remains for me to thank everybody. Thanks to Paula for organising it. Thanks to everybody else who supported. And hopefully we'll see some of you again sometime soon at one of our other events. So thank you. Goodbye and have a lovely afternoon.